Hi guys, welcome to our third video in our series of how to win Australs and do other things better too. And today we're going to talk about GLBTI rights. And I know there's many other alphabets we can put into that, but it's generally we're going to talk about sexual minorities and the issues around how to create a more progressive, accepting, and open society.
So, there's so much to say about this topic. Surprise, surprise! It covers a whole lot of contemporary issues. Everything from obviously the recent Orlando shootings, which have put some of these issues on the map, through to longer running debates about things like marriage equality and all sorts of other rights issues about how people can live and what they can do with their own bodies and how we treat those things in public. And we'll touch on some of those issues. I think it's important at the start of this kind of conversation to kind of set your terms. Mm-hmm. So people often get these kind of things confused, and it's really important in these debates, particularly if you want to have kind of credibility and be taken seriously by an adjudicator. That you get these kind of terms right. So gender and sexuality are not synonyms of each other. They are quite separate things. Your gender identity and your sexuality and your sexual identity can be very different. There's a general, very common argument that says that both of those things kind of exist on a spectrum, that, at one end of the gender spectrum, there are males, and at the other end, there are females, and that there are, points in between that. It's not a simple binary of, being one or the other. And in sexuality terms, again, there's heterosexuality at one end of the spectrum, people who are exclusively attracted to and interested to people that identify as a different gender than themselves, through to homosexuality, which is people who are exclusively sexually attracted to people who are of the same gender as they identify as, and then a whole variety of spectrums of people in the middle, who have varying shades of feelings for people similar to and different to themselves. So getting those distinctions right about sexuality and gender is really important, particularly because the debates now are becoming much more sophisticated and much more complicated than they were in years gone by. And some topics are really getting into some of these finer distinctions, and getting the language right is really, really important. So assuming that you've done all that, and if you've got questions about that, please post it on our Facebook page. We'll give you more information. We'll put some links up, but do your own research as well. Putting that aside, what are some of the main issues that we're seeing with GLBTI rights around the world? What do you think from the perspective of Asian debaters? What are the most common kind of issues that they'd be kind of confronted with? And then we'll talk a bit about Australia and the world more broadly.
Well, I think speaking on behalf of 3 billion people, my 3 billion people, I think we've come a long way, I'd say, from when I started debating. But that's probably just a statement of how old I am. But things have changed quite a bit. I think as Asian communities have globalized more, have urbanized more, we have more space to consider our personal desires, our sexual desires, and questions of our identity. And those issues have surfaced more in communities that are more open and more industrialized and more international. So, we've seen gay pride parades in countries around Asia become more common. Pretty big ones in countries like Seoul, countries like Korea, like in Seoul, that predominantly very Confucian and still very restrained, and people don't really discuss sexuality regularly. Yet it's quite acceptable to have a very huge, successful pride parade. So in that sense, I think these are issues that are more common, more open. People discuss them more, partly because of what's happening within those countries, but partly because of the media that we consume. It's common to see characters on television or in music that are homosexual, or who have different ideas of sexuality and so on, and that impacts on how we act and we behave. I think the big issues still in Asia, of course, where compared to Australia, we speaking on behalf of Malaysia or Thailand or so on, you don't really talk about marriage rights, but it'll be issues of freedom from persecution, having legislation that guarantees equal employment and things like that on the basis of freedom of discrimination on the basis of your sexuality, and also protection from abuse, from both from within like in the family being abandoned or having to leave their homes because of their sexuality, or being harassed by police or government officials because of their sexuality, and so on and so forth. So I think that's the kind of spectrum there.
Yep. So in Australia, I guess there's echoes of all those debates. We're certainly not past all of those issues by any stretch, but I think that there has been a movement on to sort of the next level of issues in Australia, because we do have anti-discrimination laws in Australia which cover gender and sexuality, and we do have equal opportunity acts and organisations that are very vigorous publicly in defending those issues. So we probably de-emphasise those issues in the public debate to move on to some other things. Marriage equality, of gay marriage, is probably the most high profile issue in Australia in the sort of GLBTI space at the moment, and it's been that way for quite a few years now, partly because we haven't resolved it in Australia. I think once we change the law in Australia, the debate will pretty much go away, but until it does, it remains a very, very big issue. And it started off as in some senses, a very polarizing debate, that there were people within the GLBTI community and groups of people who support GLBTI people who thought that marriage equality was a strange issue to sort of focus on for a rights debate, because a lot of people in the sort of progressive side of politics in Australia associate marriage with a very conservative institution, that marriage is something actually decreasing numbers of heterosexual Australians are getting married, and divorce rates are also quite high in Australia. So the idea that marriage is this very important institution is something that is still true, but diminishing kind of every year in Australia. And at the same time as you have that kind of process of marriage becoming less significant in Australia, you then had the GLBTI community say, we really want the right to do this thing. So it was a little bit strange at first, but it's now become really about a very potent symbol of equal treatment. Whatever you might think of marriage and whether people want to themselves get married, it's clearly unfair and pretty much impossible to defend why there's a group of people who are engaged in completely lawful relationships, but who then can't take it to the next level and get married. So that probably leads us to our first tip on how to deal with debates in the GLBTI space. And the first tip is, don't be opposed to GLBTI rights, because in the vast majority of cases, if you do that, you'll lose. Because if you find that your argument is predicated on why it's okay to discriminate, you will find those arguments are very, very, very difficult to sustain. So don't do it.
Yes, don't do it. So the debates are primarily, I think, in this space around the journey, not really the destination. The destination is a place where we all are respected and recognized and free to be whoever we want, whenever we want, with whoever we want. But the question is, how do we get there? And so, we were having this interesting discussion earlier about the different strategies that either the community can take or nations can take. So should you have a policy-based approach or an advocacy-based approach, or specific things that may lead to more rights but result in sacrifices from other individuals, right? So for one example that Tim raised was about whether or not we should, or the gay community or anybody should be outing gay celebrities. And this was I think a motion that has come up before and gone around, but it's a good old one, because it's fairly rich on both sides, right? The more out gay celebrities or politicians or personalities that we have in society, we create more positive role models. We normalize the idea of being homosexual and being successful and all of these things, which encourages people to be themselves. At the same time, if you're going to forcibly do this, because it's nice if people do it on their own, that's not what the debate is about. The debate is about outing people against their will. And if you do that, you are, hurting people and removing some of their fundamental rights and privileges, and maybe even harming their careers and the rest of their lives and all of those things. But that's an example of, I think, a rich debate in this space, and a debate that you can have. So both sides want to get to that right destination, but what are they willing to sacrifice in order to get there?
And you can see that in the gay marriage debate, that part of the reason why so many countries, slightly strangely, Australia is not one of them at the moment, but so many countries around the world and states in the US have moved to legalise marriage equality is just because the community has moved past it. There are still a small number of people in those places who sometimes disagree very strongly, but overwhelmingly the majority of the population have either decided that they're strongly supportive or just really, frankly, don't care one way or the other about the issue and aren't willing and aren't interested in punishing politicians who support it. And so that's really shifted the debate. And I think the vast majority of countries that have legalized gay marriage have done it after the public have already, strongly accepted it. It wasn't really a leadership move in that sense. It was more just a reflection of the community's values. But some people would argue that that's the right way to do it. That on these kind of issues that can be quite difficult and quite sensitive with particular religious groups or with older demographics who are the kinds of people who tend to oppose these rights generally. That a more softly approach is right. Not on those fundamental questions about anti-discrimination laws and protection from violence and those things, but things that don't have such a directly fundamental impact on people's lives. Maybe you can argue that needs to happen in a slower way, but that slower approach will be a more kind of robust way and a more enduring way, because once the community have moved in this direction, they don't move back. Countries that have taken the step on marriage equality don't seem to regret it, seem to have moved on to a whole lot of other issues. So that's a really good example of a kind of a journey debate about how do we get to a destination that everybody agrees on.
Yeah, but sometimes even taking the slow approach isn't necessarily non-controversial. So try to lead with education, for example. Like we're having that issue here in Victoria around the Safe Schools program, and that may be something worth looking into. And it's primarily a program built around protecting children from bullying by creating more awareness around the differences and creating more acceptance around it, and targeted at schools. And it's an opt-in only program now.
It's compulsory in all government schools, but it's opt-in for private schools,
right?
Which is part of the controversy, right? That's
exactly. So, and people are arguing that it maybe should be only opt-in, or it should be mandatory everywhere else.
Or that even if it's mandatory in the school, that individual parents should be able to object and have their children kind of taken out, or should it be something that their children are required to do?
I think it's something the parents should be required to do. You should bring the parents to schools and do it together. It
does seem like the parents have a bigger problem with it than the kids. But the other school-based issue that's become not just an issue in Australia, but has been a big issue in the US and many other places, is the rights of trans kids. So if you're not familiar with the term trans, these are people who are identified as being born as one gender, but believe that they are actually another gender, and they want to live, or in some cases, physically change themselves to be, that gender that they identify with as their real gender. And so someone who might have been born identified as a woman, but who wants to live as a man, is referred to as a trans man. And so there's debates now about, particularly in schools, about how kids who are trans and who want to identify as the gender which they believe that they are, whether they should be treated entirely as though they were, that gender. So whether a trans girl, which is someone who was born identified as a boy but is now living as a girl, should they be able to use all the same facilities in a school, like bathrooms and changing rooms, that the other girls use? And it's been pretty controversial, surprisingly, given that the number of kids who identify as trans is very, very small, for all sorts of reasons. So the real magnitude of the problem or the issue is very, very small. But in those cases where it has come up and schools have wanted to support or not support those kids, it's led to a very, very strong backlash.
One thing I found really interesting when I was doing these debates is that they don't always have to be a debate between the community and those outside the community. There's a lot of space for debates within the perspective of the LGBTI community themselves, because there's disagreement. There are people within the community who want gay marriage, some of them who don't want gay marriage, some of them who think outing is a good idea or not a good idea, or coming to it from different perspectives. Just like any other stakeholder, they aren't one group. They have different ages, they come from different backgrounds, they have different priorities. There's intersectionality between the issues that they care about, whether they care about their ethnic identity or poverty or all these other things, and which one of these things take priority. So if you are doing this debate, don't just view it from, you don't feel like you need to take the line of the bigots. If that's the only opposition that you have seen sometimes, that's the natural opposition to take, because don't do it. It's not worth it, right? Expand the community and empathize and think of yourself as one of them, and you will see that there is a lot of diversity within that, and you could have a rich debate within that from the perspectives of within the community.
Yeah, and there's a lot of interesting debates about where completely defensible sets of rights, rub up against each other. So, in the context of anti-discrimination, nobody is going to argue that, someone who identifies as being gay or being trans, shouldn't be able to work, in a convenience store or in an office or in a politician's office. But should they be able to be a teacher in a religious school if they're, qualified as a teacher? There's a serious debate about that in Australia and about whether or not the opportunity to work as a teacher should be protected, of course. But does that extend all the way to any context, and what are the limits that schools, as one example, but other types of workplaces have, where it's not just about the qualification, arguably, it's not just about the qualifications that you have that might determine the kind of person you want, but also other aspects of that person might be argued as relevant to whether they should be employed or not. And in Victoria, we've had this debate at a pretty fine level, right? Should a religious school be able to stop someone who's not a member of that faith from being a teacher or an employee in that school? And on the one hand, it's pretty hard to argue that you should have to be a Catholic in order to be a gardener in a Catholic school. Doesn't seem like your religious affiliations there matter very much. But should you be able to be not a Catholic and teach religion in a Catholic school? Or some people would say no. Does the religion matter in teaching English? Does it matter in teaching maths? Where do you draw the line in these things? And but those are some quite rich debates where it's not about whether or not you're a bigot or not. It's about how you think different sets of rights intersect with each other, and those debates can be very good without anybody necessarily saying anything horrible and terrible. So let's go back to the first rule: don't say horrible and terrible things. Don't take the side of the bigots. Never find yourself in a situation where you're arguing against the rights of genuinely oppressed minority groups. Just find ways to talk about the best way that we can achieve a more genuinely inclusive society for everybody.
Because that's the best kind of society.
So, thanks very much. Hope you've enjoyed all these videos so far. If you've got questions and comments, please leave them on our Facebook page, and we'll do our best to try to respond to them as quick as we can. If you haven't seen our other videos on housing affordability and the economy, or on refugees and asylum seeker debates, you should totally check those out. They're really good. If I do say so myself, they're pretty great.
Yeah, they're not bad. I've watched it. It's okay. Those two guys, they're not bad.
And if you're thinking, if you're coming to Australs, rug up. It's pretty cold here at the moment. So, bring a coat and have fun. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yep. Bye.
Cool.
That's good. Yeah.